My talk is called Walking a Mile in Your User's Shoes. That was a great intro, but I'm just do a quick intro. My name is Jameson. My friends call me Jamey. We're all friends, so you can call me Jamey. I'm here from Buffalo, New York, the home of bad sports. I promise that joke is funnier when I'm not 16,000 kilometers from home. It's my first time in Australia. It's my first time at RubyConf Australia. I'm really honored to be here. All of the talks have been stellar so far. It's been an amazing event, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it. As she said, I'm on Greater Than Code. If you've heard that podcast, you may have heard my voice before. It's basically a tech podcast where we talk about the human side of tech. Like, these are the people that wrote the code that you use, and this is kind of where they came from in their life that got them to that point. You can find me on Twitter or anywhere really on the web at Jamey Bash. Find me, be my friend, tweet about my talk, send me memes. The only thing is I do use they, them pronouns, so please keep that in mind if you're going to talk about me publicly. So I minored in computer science when I was in college. And one of my computer science professors always used to tell me that there were two traits that made good programmers. The first is that they were scared of bugs. And the second is that they were lazy. And I thought that was really funny. I was in college, and I was like, being lazy. But actually, I do think that being lazy is a thing that kind of makes us good programmers in some ways. We want to write reusable code. We don't want to do more work than we have to do. We work very efficiently. We do workarounds. And so I think that that is kind of a good trait. But I also think that it gives us this tendency sometimes to forget that it's not as easy for everyone as it is for us to work with computers. Not everyone has the skills to write a script instead of doing something tedious over and over. So when we forget that our workarounds aren't the real thing for how most people interact with our app, that can be a problem. And so I want to propose a third trait for good programmers, empathy. This is a talk about empathy. So what is empathy, really? What do I mean when I say that? The definition of empathy is, being able to connect with other people. And when I was doing the research for this talk, there were really three kinds of empathy that I came across. The first is social empathy. And that's the idea that you can sense what someone else is feeling. That's kind of what we think of a lot of times when we talk about empathy. That's not really what I'm going to talk about in this talk. But the second type it's called cognitive empathy. And that's kind of where you get this phrase, walking a mile in someone's shoes. It's the idea that you can understand someone else's perspective and where they're coming from. And then the third kind is empathetic concern. And that's the idea that if something is wrong, I can sense it. Maybe I can understand your perspective on it. But not only that, I also want to do something to help. And I hope that we do. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. This isn't really a feelings talk. I think feelings talks are really, really great and important. But this is going to be a little bit more technical. So I kind of want to get right into what this means for us in tech. What does it mean to work in tech? Or perhaps a better question is, what does it mean? What's the difference between being a tech worker versus actually working in the tech industry, which not all of us do? Because everyone needs applications. Code is code, really. Once you know how to write code, you can write it for anyone who needs code. And everybody needs code in this day and age. These are some of the different industries that I've worked in over the course of my career. And essentially, I was using my skills in a very similar way at all of them. This is a perk of our industry, by the way. We're very privileged to be able to kind of choose what industries we want to work in. It gives us the opportunity to find jobs that we really care about, things that we find important. And I think that that's a really cool thing about being a programmer. But why does that matter? I just said code is code. It's the same for everything. So why does it matter which industry you're working in? Why is it different? And the answer to that is because of the user base that you're working with and working for. So let's say you're a developer and you work, for instance, for Stack Overflow. I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics. I do want to say two things before I get way into them. The first is that I'm not like specifically trying to call out Stack Overflow or anything. I use them as my example because they have their yearly developer survey, and they have really interesting demographic data about their user base as part of that survey. So it was kind of useful and interesting to look through. The other thing that I want to note is that I'm going to show some demographics that I'm going to describe as maybe objectively bad in some ways. That's not really the point of what I'm trying to get at today, so I just kind of want to address, like, yes, there's some issues with the demographics in our industry. I can recognize that and then like continue to kind of talk about what I'm trying to talk about for this. So you may already have an idea of what I mean by that. This is the gender breakdown of Stack Overflow users, extremely overwhelmingly male. Also pretty overwhelmingly white. I have to go through these fairly quickly, but I will put the slides up if you want to look at these demographics in more depth later. The age one is also interesting. 25 to 34 is kind of the big one, but there's a bell curve down from there. 65 years and older, you'll notice, is the top one, and is at 0.3%. I'm going to talk about that again later. This graph is super interesting to me because this isn't something that I had really considered before when I started doing the research for this talk. This is your parents' highest education level. And as you can see, really high percentages of people who have parents that were in college, even like masters and above, higher education. And it's interesting because this kind of idea of like the privilege of growing up as like middle class is a very real thing, to be honest. Privilege isn't even exactly what I'm getting at here, but I do think it's like part of it. So I have some observations about these demographics after looking at them. And the biggest one is that they might look kind of like us. Like, not exactly like us, and not on the individual. You know, I'm a gender minority. I'm actually less than 1% of a gender minority, according to the statistics. So that first graph didn't look like me at all. But like when we look out onto a room of conference goers, it's like we come from this kind of shared background. Maybe we live a life that's similar to the lives that other developers live. And that's important when we're building applications. We want to build things that feel intuitive. We think about what would feel intuitive to us and what would work for us. And so if a developer works for Stack Overflow or any other company where other developers are the main user base, if your application feels intuitive to you, maybe it's going to be intuitive to your users too. Maybe that's a good metric. But that's not true of all industries and all companies where there are programmers working there. I worked for 4 years until just recently in the agriculture sector, which I will talk more about later, but I'm going to use agriculture as kind of my example. So I read the 2012 United States Government Census of Agriculture while I was researching for this talk, which is riveting stuff, let me tell you. And the demographics look pretty different. This is the gender graph. Again, these ones are even more confusing to read, so I will post these. As you can see, there's also a gender problem in agriculture. It's actually not as bad as the one in tech, interestingly. This is a chart of farms that were principally operated by people of color, and it's not great, but it is growing. And I do also want to note that this is talking specifically about principal operators, the person who owns or is the primary runner on the farm. I could not find data on like all agriculture workers in this survey, which was kind of annoying. But like those numbers would also be less white than this graph and much less than the tech graph. These charts, the age charts, are wild. So if you remember, the highest one in tech was 65 plus, and it was only 0.3%. The biggest one here is 55 to 64, and then 65 to 74, and even 75 plus is like a huge section in this graph, which is super interesting, actually, because age is a huge factor in the way that someone interacts with technology, like more than gender or race. This is a chart about the percentage of different demographic groups that have internet access. And the fact that this is even a chart at all that they put in the census says something about how different these kind of groups of people are from the Stack Overflow group. So it's interesting to kind of get that feel for the people that you're working with. I also want to mention one thing about the flow of empathy. I'm going to talk a lot in this talk about empathy from us as programmers to the people that use our apps. But I think that it's important to note that empathy flows both ways. I hope that my users can also have empathy for me. Say if my app goes down, maybe just extend that kind of hand. Sometimes we are the users. For things like Stack Overflow or GitHub. When those projects go down, it's important to think about the empathy for that team, people who are probably having a really bad day. And that's where HugOps kind of came from, this idea that people will go on Twitter and complain, oh, GitHub is down, Slack is down, it's ruining my day. Well, let's show a little compassion for the people that have to deal with that. So I've talked about this a little bit in the abstract. But actually, I think it's really helpful to talk about it in the specifics. So I'm going to do a couple of case studies of projects that I've worked on in my career where I was kind of spending a lot of energy trying to relate to the people that I was working on this app for. And the first one is called Medicapped. I used to be a consultant, and this was a project I worked on. It was an Android app used for prosecuting sexual assault cases in developing countries. PHR, Physicians for Human Rights, that's the NGO that kind of hired us to work on it. And basically the premise is that there are areas in the world where sexual assault victims are really high percentages, and sometimes report rates are really low. And they decided that they thought one of the big factors in that was that it was difficult to report. If a woman was sexually assaulted, it was very likely that she would go and have a medical exam, like for her health. But then if she wanted to report it to the authorities, it was very likely that she would have to go through like additional exams. It was very invasive. It was like bringing up a lot of trauma after an experience that was already very traumatic. And so the premise of Medicapped is, what if the doctors who were doing this initial health examination, which was happening anyway for most people, could record that information in a format that would be admissible into the court system. And then if someone wanted to report, they wouldn't have to do any more work. They would just have to consent to that information being shared at the end. So this is kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about working on projects that you think are really important. I thought that this was really important, and it was important to me to work on this. And it was also a really interesting technical project. I kind of knew going into it was going to be different than other things I had worked on in the past. And I had this list of challenges I expected to face. I knew there were going to be privacy concerns. We thought about that from the get-go. We had a custom PIN system that was very strict, so like you couldn't pick up a phone and see people's information. Most apps, when you take photos, will save them also on the camera roll. We like manually disabled all of that. Like the photos weren't stored on the phone, only in our servers. Chain of custody was an issue. In the legal world, that's always an issue. This paper trail where you can detect like who accessed these files and when, proof that people read them or saw them. So we were doing that digitally. And we knew that there was going to be a lack of Wi-Fi at some of the places where this was being used. So we planned to use a NoSQL solution. We used Couchbase database, actually. And you could if you didn't have Wi-Fi, you could put your info in on the phone. It would store it locally, only temporarily. And then when you got internet connection, it would sync to our servers and then remove it from the phone. So that was all pretty interesting. One thing to note about this list is that these are all pretty high-tech things. This was clearly a list that was written by a programmer. And also that none of these constraints are like inherently unique. It was a slightly unique situation because we were working with so many constraints at once. But constraints are a part of every project. So I worked on this app for a while. And then I had the chance to actually go to the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a picture of me there with some of the people that I was working with at PHR. And it completely changed how I was thinking about the project. Once I was there, working with the doctors, talking directly to them, I realized that there was this whole other set of concerns that I hadn't even really thought about. Like, I live in America, and I'm a programmer, and I just wasn't conceptualizing what people's lives were like when they were trying to use this app. And so that was really kind of eye-opening and interesting to see. And so here are some of the challenges that were like actually the biggest things that I was working on once I was there and doing it. It wasn't just Wi-Fi that was unreliable. They wanted to do printing. That was kind of important, but there weren't printers in the hospitals already. In fact, there wasn't even reliable electricity at the hospitals that I was working at. So that was kind of the first time I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, I can't just magic up electricity for someone. Like, how are we going to do this? We're really thinking out of the box here. Inexperienced user base, and it occurred to me that like maybe I would be working with people who weren't as comfortable with smartphones as like myself or like people that I was used to. But it turned out that I was working with people who had like never used a smartphone before in their entire lives, which I guess I didn't expect. So that was really interesting because like things that felt very intuitive to me to the point where I didn't even think about them at all, like were not intuitive. It was not intuitive to like click on the text box to get the cursor to come up and be able to type. We also created like test accounts that they could use and like test out the app, and we gave them like, you know, test username and passwords basically, and they had underscores in them. But they didn't know how to write underscores, which actually is totally unintuitive if you're not used to it. Like, you have to go into punctuation, and then you have to like capitalize the punctuation. It's like very confusing. We could have totally avoided this issue if we just not put underscores in their usernames, but I didn't think about it. There were language barriers as well, which we knew. The app was in French. We had translated it into French, but our translations were not as good as we thought they were. So the main page had like, one of the big words that we use is like records, like store record, view records, like files. But the word that we had used in French was record, like you beat the record at sports. And so when they opened it up, people were like, what does this say? What does this mean? The lack of tech support was also a big thing. There was like no IT people around for if something went wrong. It was super important for it to be like highly reliable and for us to have like solutions and troubleshooting already set up, like either that they could refer back to or in the app. Like, I went there and taught everyone how to use it, and then I left after a week and I wasn't there anymore. So that was a big thing. And like trust issues ended up being like the biggest thing. We were working with people who weren't used to smartphones, weren't used to technology. They were distrustful of it. Like, they were really worried about security. They didn't like the idea of the cloud, which is how we were doing it. They wanted to like see servers like in their building, and we were like, we're not sure if we can do that. So like, I was expecting to have these like really high-tech conversations, and I ended up having a lot of conversations that were just like, it's okay, like don't worry, we've thought about all this security stuff, like it's gonna be okay to use it. And we had to like implement a lot of non-standard solutions, different than how I was used to working in tech. You can hit a lot of considerations with the right hardware, and we were in the position to be providing some of the hardware for them, and so we had a lot of say. So I did a lot of like market research on printers. I needed something with like a long battery life. I wanted it to have removable batteries so they could be charged elsewhere where electricity was more reliable and then like brought for backups. It had to be Bluetooth. I was looking into how the troubleshooting was, like, is it confusing? Is it like user-friendly? So it's kind of different to how we're used to programming, because normally it's like very important that things work on all devices. And we basically only cared that it worked on like these like couple of devices that we picked, but it had to be like perfect. And we built a ton of stuff from scratch, which is also kind of not how I'm used to normally programming. Like, we're always using libraries. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And like, we kind of had to reinvent a lot of stuff. We didn't feel like we were doing something extremely unique, but because of the combination of constraints, we kind of were in some ways. So we kept finding solutions that were like, oh, if we had one less constraint, like we could do this pre-made thing, but you can't just like lose constraints in that way. So we wasted a lot of time fretting over that we could have saved if we had just kind of accepted that we were going to have to write things from scratch at the beginning. And because of the troubleshooting thing, the UI was very different than what we would be used to. It was very modular, like, OK, now turn on the printer. Have you turned it on? Yes. Now plug in the cord. Is it plugged in? Yes. It was like, it forced you to go very slow and do all of the steps before you could get to the next step, which would be like super frustrating, I think, if you like felt very comfortable with it. But that's what they wanted because they were like nervous that if people forgot how to do it or they had to teach new people and I wasn't there to help them, they like needed it to kind of be there to help them. So that was also really interesting. And it was a really rewarding project to work on. My second case study is my agriculture story, also very rewarding to work on. Again, I worked here at this company called Artemis until very recently. I'm still saying we because I just left. It was like a really cool team and a really cool product. A startup in New York that did farm management for indoor farms and greenhouses. It was a pretty powerful tool. It can do like seed to harvest tracking. It's got labor management. It does climate control, data analysis, yield predictions, all that kind of stuff. Really interesting stuff in the agriculture sector, to be honest. And it also meant that all of our customers were farmers, which was super cool because it meant that I got to go and like meet farmers on their farms, see what they were doing, see all of everything they were growing. And that was really cool. And I think that it's really important to kind of meet people where they are in that way because that's how you get a sense for what people are doing on the day-to-day, and that's how you foster empathy, really. This is like the crux of the whole empathy story. And it was similar to my experience in Medicap, which I had already done at that point. And so I knew this value of going and like meeting people and talking to them directly. So I'm going to talk about a few aspects from Artemis that I think kind of ping this same theme of requirements gathering and having empathy for your users. There were language barriers with this project also. We used I-18N for our internationalization. I'm not going to go way into that because it's not a talk about I-18N, but while I was there, we translated into these languages. And there were weird edge cases that came up when we were doing this that were kind of interesting, like things that we weren't thinking about or didn't expect. When we were going into translating into Arabic, we wanted to change the order of the menu bars to be more intuitive to people who read a language that goes the other way. But then when we flipped it, it like flipped all of the letters and made it look silly, and then our app looked silly, and we were like, why didn't we think of this? This is so obvious. The most interesting one to me was our name. When I first started working there, our company was called Agralist. It was called Agralist for the first several years I worked there. But it turns out that Agralist, the word, is like unpronounceable gibberish in Spanish. You just can't even say it at all. And we were getting to the point where a lot of our users were Spanish speaking, and they like couldn't say the name of our app, and we were like, this is terrible. But we weren't, like, when we were a brand new startup, we weren't thinking about pronounceability in other languages. And so we ended up like changing the name of our app and like rebranding, and it was pretty interesting. Layout is also kind of a big one because we talk a lot about user friendliness. Well, what does that mean? You know, we're talking about something that feels intuitive to use, feels simple for people. But the reason that it feels simple or intuitive is because it relies on our existing familiarity. For instance, like the back button is always in the top left corner of the screen or whatever. Is there like research that says that like that's the best place to put the back button? I guess I'm not really sure. But at this point, the back button has been in that same place for so long that that's where we go to look for it because that's where we expect it to be. So we had done a big refactor recently where we added a calendar view for tasks. And this was something that like all of our customers had been asking for. And the reason was because they used Google Calendar already. And so they wanted our website to feel more like Google Calendar feels because they were familiar and comfortable with it. So that totally made sense. But if it was something that we had thought of earlier, we could have like built it in kind of the first time rather than having to refactor it in. And the same was true of our mobile app. We had a desktop app that we thought was really perfect and beautiful, and it worked really well. But it turns out that like the owners of farms were using our desktop app, and it was working great for them when they were like setting up their farm planning. But the employees were using it out while they were working in the greenhouses with the plants, and they had like phones. And so even though we felt it was like perfect, it was kind of worthless for them because they were like trying to use it responsibly on their phones, and it wasn't perfect. And so we realized like this is not going to work without a mobile app, and we had to completely re-change our timeline of what we were working on to like get that out as soon as possible because people really needed it. And like I said, requirements gathering, like when you're deciding what features to implement, it's so important to talk directly to people and get their perspective because people will say things that you were not thinking about. Plant sites is my favorite example of something that was easy to implement, to be honest, but just I hadn't been thinking about. And so the idea here is that we had like batch units, like trays or rafts in your farm, and we use them for two things. We use them for quantity, tracking quantity, and we also use them for tracking capacity. So you could say, you know, I have 50 trays, that's how many I have. Now I have an idea of like how many plants I have. But also there's 50 trays currently in my greenhouse, and then we could calculate what percentage of their greenhouse was full and what percentage was empty so they could plan. Except that it didn't really work because we let you have decimal points. You could have, you know, say I have 1.5 trays, which makes sense for quantity, but it's not great for capacity because if you have 1.5 trays, you still have 2 trays that are taking up space in that room. So we ended up remedying this with this plant site idea. So you could say I have 1 tray in my greenhouse, but actually it only has 60, it's only half full, it only has 60 plant sites. So yeah, this was like a pretty easy thing to implement, a pretty cool feature in my opinion, but the only reason that anyone thought of this is because we had people who were going to farms and doing visits and talking to people about their day-to-day in this way. Like I had never thought of this. I was at home writing code. I was really concerned with like floats and integers, and this idea of how people were really using it in real life was a little bit out of the scope of what I was thinking about at the time. My third one says case study number 3-ish. It's a little bit less of a case study than the first two because accessibility isn't something that I've like explicitly worked specifically on in my career, but it is something that I think about a lot, and it's something that I think is very important to think about a lot. So accessibility is also a huge topic. I'm not going to be able to cover anywhere near all of it. You could do a whole talk. You could do a whole conference that's all talks about accessibility, and you still couldn't cover all of it. But there are a couple of things that I think specifically are in this same theme, like things that might be easy or low tech if we were to think of them, but we overlook because we haven't thought of them at all. And I want to kind of just hammer this in again. I really love this tweet. This is really at the crux of a lot of what I'm trying to say. Disabled people aren't the edge case. Tech people are the edge case. Tech people are the edge case. We represent a small portion of the population, and we're in charge of designing and building. Too often we design for people exactly like us. I think this idea of looking at your users as an edge case is really common and can also be kind of really dangerous. I see people do this all the time. I do this. Like if one of my users triggers a bug in my application in a way that like feels like a weird way to use it to me, it's very tempting to be like, well, I don't know, like nobody does that. That's an edge case. Like why are they doing it in this way? But obviously, when I say nobody does that, like they do. They just did it. People do it, and I need to react to that rather than just kind of reacting to, you know, treating it as like an annoyance that people are using your product, which it's not. So screen readers. This is kind of one that comes up a lot when we talk about accessibility because some people experience the entire internet using screen readers. And if you've never personally used a screen reader, or at least tested with one, you probably don't really understand what kind of experience those people are having. So I think it's really valuable to do that. Alt text for photos is the big one that always comes up. If someone's blind and they're using a screen reader to go on the internet, if you post a photo and there's no alt text, they're not going to know what that photo is of. And the same is true of like screen caps of text. People do this on Twitter a lot to try and get around like the character limit. But if you put a bunch of words in a picture and then you put it on Twitter, someone with a screen reader isn't going to have any idea what those words say. It's just completely inaccessible to them. Unicode fonts and excessive emoji. This one was really eye-opening for me. What do I mean by Unicode fonts? This is my Twitter screen name, username, Jameson, son of Jamey. People will use these Unicode tag. You don't have fonts on Twitter. So people will use Unicode to kind of like trick it into being like, oh, my name is in like a fancy font. It looks so cute. These are like a few examples of different ones. But the problem is that a lot of screen readers like can't detect these as words because they're not using real letters. So this would come through a screen reader like uppercase cursive Unicode letter J, uppercase cursive lowercase or letter A, lowercase cursive Unicode letter M, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you do it in your username, it's particularly bad because then it has to read all of that out every time you post something and every time you show up on someone's timeline. The same is super true of emoji. This one's tough.
Graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign, y'all. Graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign, y'all. Emoji colon clapping hand
we can listen to it now.
Emoji colon clapping hand sign, yeah. Graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign tweets. Graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign after graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign. I graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign quote graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign and graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign making graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign make graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign look graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign stupid graphic emoji colon clapping hand sign.
When I first was putting this talk together, I was like, can I really make everyone listen to this entire thing? And then I was like, yes, I have to make everyone listen to this entire thing, because that's what it's like if you're using screen readers. And I know it's tough, because I also love emoji. But I feel bad for people that like have to experience the internet like this all of the time. The least we can do is like try to make it a little bit better for them. Use of color in design is also a big one. This is one that probably people have thought about, at least some, because like if you have really crappily contrasting colors on your site, that's like kind of bad for everybody. But people are colorblind, and colorblind people will have like a much lower tolerance for bad contrast and such. That's why there's like rules or at least guidelines about accessibility on the web and like how you can like plug your website into guidelines like this, and it will tell you if it passes or fails at different sizes. We also use color to mean things in our design, like a lot. Like we have green means success, and red means failure. I think that one's pretty interesting because that red-green combo is a particularly common one, and also red-green colorblindness is the most common form of colorblindness. So that's making it like more difficult for colorblind people to look at your design and like understand what's going on with it quickly. Sometimes it's even impossible. Required fields marked in red, that's the only difference between. So if you're colorblind, then you just have no idea what's going on with this form. And I think this one really struck me because if the person who made this form like had thought about this at all, it would have taken like 1/4 of 1 second to add asterisks also. So if they couldn't tell the different colors, it was still usable, but obviously it was not something that had occurred to them. So I've talked a lot about empathy. I have a few takeaway lessons that I want to go back over before I finish my talk. Cultivating empathy for your users is essential for creating an app that actually works for them. Not for you, for them. Predicting what people's pain points will be is hard. It's legitimately hard. And also developers are bad at it. Requirements gathering is a huge, difficult problem in our industry. And empathy is a huge step towards solving it. You have to make sure you're solving the right problems, though, by meeting your users and getting a feel for what it's like to be them. The first step that I've kind of talked about a lot is like even thinking about this stuff at all. I think that that's really important. But sometimes we think that we're showing empathy, but we're really not. And that can be tough, because like, how do you really, really know what someone else is going through without experiencing life, in their shoes? And that's why I think it's so valuable to go and do these like face-to-face meetings with people on kind of their own turf, where they live and do their work on the day-to-day. Those kind of visits have been extremely valuable to me in my career. I think that they're extremely valuable in general. And simple, clever solutions can often be just as valuable or more valuable than highly technical solutions. We're programmers. We love highly technical solutions. I get it. I love puzzles. We all want to use the new shiny thing. I feel it too. But like, if we're only doing stuff that's highly technical just for the sake of being highly technical or flashy, and it's not actually improving people's experiences, that's not really valuable at all. Fostering empathy will improve your applications, and it will improve the world. This is the last sentence in my proposal, and it was important to me for it to be the last slide of my talk. If you do something to make your app better, it will make it better. It will make it better for your users. It will make it a better product. And that's cool. It's cool to want to have a better product. But in addition to that, it's also going to make you better as a person, because it's going to give you a better understanding for other people what they're going through. And it will make the people around you better, because you're bringing everybody into this experience where we can all share our perspective. And that's even cooler than cool. It's ice cold. Thank you so much for having me, letting me talk about this. It's very important to me. Thank you for letting me make an Outcast joke at the very last slide of my talk, and for having me at RubyConf. If you want to find me online, talk to me. It's so good to meet all of you.